T-minus 10 seconds.
You're listening to News and Movies Radio. newsandmoviesradio.com. Where the world comes to listen.
Yes, you lucky people, just sit back for a moment, relax, and notice the delightfully clean, cool, and refreshing atmosphere of this scientifically air-conditioned theater. Great, isn't it? Remember, you can enjoy great motion picture entertainment all summer long in cool comfort at this theater.
Welcome to News and Movies Radio, broadcasted live around the world. Today I'll be talking with longtime American Illustrative artwork dealer Fred Taraba on the history of original movie poster art and learn more about noted artist and illustrator Reynold Brown, who painted and designed movie posters for classic American films such as Creature from the Black Lagoon, Tarantula, This Island Earth, and Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Stay tuned, you're listening to News and Movies Radio, newsandmoviesradio.com.
For the absolute finest in vintage movie memorabilia, look no further than BuyMoviePostersInc.com. Buy Movie Posters Inc. features an incredible selection of hand-picked original movie posters, lobby cards, and stills from all over the world, with titles from the classic era of Hollywood to the present. Browse our online gallery and email us your want lists as we scour the globe for more hidden treasures. Also, Buy Movie Posters Inc. is always looking to buy quality movie memorabilia. If you have movie material that you'd like to sell outright or consign, email us at buymovieposters@gmail.com. You won't be disappointed.
Welcome back. My guest on the show today is American Illustrative artwork dealer Fred Taraba. Fred is a noted expert on identifying, valuing, and locating original artwork and paintings that were created by some of the most famous illustrators in American history, including the likes of Charles Addams, Reynold Brown, and Bob Peak. He spent 8 years as the assistant director, curator, and head librarian of the Society of Illustrators Museum in New York City, and 16 years as director of New York's Illustration House Gallery. Today he runs Taraba Illustration Art, where he continues to deal in rare one-of-a-kind artwork from prolific artists known for their illustrations capturing America's pastime. Fred, welcome to News and Movies Radio.
Hey, thanks. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so I read where you moved your business from New York out to Wyoming after years of operation in the Big Apple. The vibe's got to be completely different for you.
Oh yeah, it's a whole new ball game for me. But you know what? I love it. So it's all good.
I've always wanted to see Yellowstone National Park and visit Wind River, and they have a lot of cool Native American Indian reservations there. I think of Wyoming, I immediately think of films such as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and probably my favorite Spielberg film is Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and they've got that big Devil's Tower out in Wyoming, so the views out there have got to be pretty spectacular.
It is, and you know, the great thing about it is it's so humbling in a way, because you can see forever. You realize what a tiny spot on the earth we all are.
Mm-hmm. So, in the beginning, it seems like the opportunity for you to be one of the first ones to bring an artist's work to market would require a lot of connections and be ultra competitive. And that's what you do while you sell original illustration art. You've got big auction houses like Christie's and Sotheby's, but a lot of times the heirs for these great artists, they want their pieces to go to the right person or the right organization where it can be treasured and appreciated, right?
Oh yeah, that's absolutely true. You know, there are kind of as many different ways for, say, heirs to approach this whole question as there are, you know, people out there. You know, some just do a knee-jerk thing of going to Christie's or Sotheby's and trying to sell stuff that way, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Well, being kind of the gatekeeper for connecting artists and their families to buyers would be a lot of people. I know for me, it would be a dream job. Can you talk a little bit about how you got started?
After I got out of college, I wanted to work on the East Coast, having gone to school out there. I lived in Minnesota, most of my life up to then. And so I started writing letters, kind of introducing myself to a variety of institutions, big and small, all along the East Coast, from, say, Washington, D.C. up to Boston. And Society of Illustrators was actually one of the extremely few, shall we say, who showed any interest in me. And so, signed up with them, and from there, I met a lot of the greats who were still around in the early 80s, and there were quite a few of them. And I fell in love with the art form and the, kind of the idea of being involved in that. Mm-hmm. One thing led to another, and ultimately I went to Illustration House and then here.
So when you were at Illustration House, was it there you were able to kind of develop the connections that eventually allowed you to branch out on your own and start your own business?
I did develop a lot of connections there, but it was I never really saw myself as competing with them. Mm-hmm. I could offer people maybe more of a personalized service, and could get other types of things in that they wouldn't generally get because they were, bigger organization. I had to stay light on my feet, being very small, and so it wasn't one of these things where, I said, I've done 16 years here, let me take my Rolodex and go. It wasn't like that at all.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of shows, there aren't very many actually movie poster shows. There's an event in Ohio that I try to get to every year. And of course, there's lots of comic book shows these days. You've got one in New York. You've got ones now in even Florida and Texas. And of course, the big one's out in San Diego, which has become more of a pop culture festival more so than anything. What are some of the major shows for exhibiting original illustrations and commercial artwork? I remember you were on a video, or maybe we talked about it, that you have in the past set up at the San Diego Comic-Con, right?
I have, and I've been doing that on my own ever since I was on my own. And I did it, for several years on behalf of Illustration House, too. So I've probably done, probably close to 20 of those now.
Wow.
It's probably, it's probably not quite 20. It might be 18 or something. But yeah, I've done it a bunch of times.
Mm-hmm. Are there conventions like comic book shows and pulp and paper shows that kind of cross over into original artwork that make it worthwhile to set up at these things?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, the best one, in that it's the show that doesn't have a lot of the, whatever you want to call it, pitfalls of Comic-Con, which is that it's so huge. Comic-Con is so huge, it's overwhelming to visitors as well as exhibitors. I really like, there's a show that takes place in the suburbs of Chicago every April called Windy City Pulp and Paper Convention. And I set up every year there. I've been doing that probably 8 or 9 years. And that's a good show. It's very congenial. Not a ton of art, but there's probably 20 people who have art there, including myself. Every pulp magazine you could ever want to see, pretty much. And that's a really good show. Actually, several of my clients go to that show to, see me and see other dealers who have this stuff. My favorite. But,
and so that's not in conjunction with like Wizard World Chicago or the Chicago Comic-Con. When is that set up? When is the Windy City Pulp Fest set up?
It's always in April, and I would have to check the exact date this coming year. But, your listeners could go to Windy City Pulp and Paper find it. I want to say it's the 4th and 5th, but I'm not gonna swear to that because I don't want to say the wrong thing.
It sounds like a great show. Particularly, even if you can't afford the original art, there's a lot of cool pulps you probably won't find on eBay or anywhere else. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you also, too, you hear about in comic books and in the movie posters, discoveries being made in attics or crawl spaces or basements. Heirs maybe inherit a collection, or they come into possession of their parents' home, and there's this mysterious closet where they find these comic books or posters in the walls. Over the last 20 or 30 years, in terms of original illustration art, has there been any major discoveries, like in lost archives or new home buyers discovering original artworks in closets or attics upon moving in?
I mean, I won't say there haven't been any, but it's really unusual for that to actually happen, particularly in the movie poster. Well, let me rephrase that: the movie poster art work. You know, I think a big part of that is that there are, you know, when someone, you know, discovers something, say, there are tons of options they have. You know, as far as, you know, they might go to local estates. Sometimes you will see these rather local auctions. Sometimes you see these local auctions that will have, you know, 30 pieces by an artist who is known, who's a known talent, all come out at once, and they'd say, "Oh, we cleaned out this house, and here it is." So a lot of times it's kind of incumbent on the heirs or whoever's buying the house to do the research to figure out whether it's worth anything. You know, a lot of stuff just winds up at, you know, Salvation Army or another charitable organization, what have you.
It does seem like the effort the artists put into their work, the discoveries in your hobby or your neck of the woods would be rather unusual compared to others. But on that note, let's talk a little bit about original movie poster artwork. In the 1940s and the 1950s, it did seem that studios were far more dependent on film's campaign materials in generating excitement and getting viewers into theaters than they do these days. I'm reminded of actually going to a movie this past weekend and not even seeing any movie posters. They were all digital displays. But I read in an article, a recent article, and it talked about how during the 1950s, studios were releasing, on average, some of them were releasing 15 pictures per week. I guess that kind of explains the original one-of-a-kind artwork that we'll likely never see again, at least mass-produced.
Yeah. You know, and that, you know, that has a lot to do with how the marketing of film has changed. You know, now it's much more star-dependent than any kind of promotion. If there's a movie that you have not heard of anybody who's in the cast of, you're not very likely to go unless it's part of something bigger story, like a sequel situation.
Mm-hmm. And I also remember seeing in a recent interview with Roger Corman, who's famous B director. He directed cult classics such as The Wasp Woman and Not of This Earth. He also did Attack of the Crab Monsters. He stated movie poster designs back in the 40s and 50s, when he started directing films, their sole purpose was actually enticing audiences in the theaters, correct? This was before they had widespread ad campaigns with trailers and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And a lot of that, too, has to do with the fact that if you think about a place or places that you would learn about the movie being out, okay? If it was a big production, you might see it in a magazine, you know, Look magazine or Life magazine or whatever. Otherwise, if it's something like, you know, Attack of the Crab Monsters, you would maybe see it in a local newspaper. You drive past the drive-in theater and see it on the marquee. Or you'd see a poster design, you know, typically outside of the theater. And that was it. There was was no, of course, no television advertising. And, movie and film advertising on the radio, it doesn't, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I wouldn't think it would work that well.
Mm-hmm.
Or would have at that time.
And we'll talk about this here more in a bit, but I also learned that a lot of the features, such as Roger Corman and some others were produced by AIP, were so low budget and badly directed that theaters would actually allow those pictures to only run for 1 week. So many times directors would approach an artist, a poster artist, and try to get them to oversell the film, correct? Like out of desperation.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that if you look at movie poster designs for that whole universe of films, if you haven't seen the film, you say, wow, this looks great. I'm going to go see this. And then you go and you say, well, wait a minute. That it's not what was being sold to me.
Mm.
And, people were paying 50 cents to get in or whatever, so it's not such a big deal. But absolutely, they were overselling every aspect of the movie. How scary the monster was, how pretty the female lead was, the gore, the destruction, everything.
And in some cases, it's almost
low budget, so it only makes sense to oversell it.
In some cases, it's almost as if too the director, he produced and directed the picture. He realized at the end of it, after the end of production, they'd either run out of money or he just looked at the project and knew it was going to be terrible. Then they created the movie poster at the very end to kind of cover up everything, cover their losses in a sense. But
sure. Or on these tight schedules that they'd be up against, as you were saying, releasing 15 films a week, they would approach a movie poster artist and say, okay, here's a story. We don't have a script yet, but here's a story. Giant bug gets gianter by nuclear, fusion and attacks this town. Make us a poster. And so guys like Reynold Brown would create these things, or at least start to create them out of their heads, not knowing who the film's quote-unquote stars were or what the bug looked like or anything.
Yeah, they hadn't even seen a single frame of the film. And,
exactly, and in part because oftentimes a single frame didn't exist yet.
So for artists like Reynold Brown, who we'll talk about here more in a bit, how long did it take for them to draw a poster, and would they be working on more than one project at one time?
Well, I think it depends a lot on the individual artist, for one thing, and also on the individual film. But my sense of it is that I recall reading somewhere that they'd have about a month deadline. But, they could very well be working on 4 or 5 things at the same time. It's hard to say exactly how long. Does that mean a week? I guess probably a week of actual, work towards the deadline.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of work, would they start out in pencil and then move to black and white and then watercolor? Is that typically how it worked in terms of producing these posters?
I do think that that's a fair way to put it, yeah. But, in a lot of these cases, because of the budget, a lot of movie poster artists would do a pencil sketch based on the description from the art director or the director of the film even, or someone at the studio. They would do pencil sketches and get those, and when I say approved, I mean, was it a giant cockroach or a giant spider? It's a very different thing, of course. So they'd have to get that approved, and they kind of go from there, and that would often mean that there wasn't really that intermediate step of the black and white before they went to watercolor.
Mm-hmm.
So they could go directly from the pencil drawing to the final watercolor, conception.
Or could they ever just start with watercolor? I mean, that would be kind of it would seem like they'd need to have some type of approval before they moved on to that final step.
I think typically they would have needed some kind of approval, even just thumbnail sketches of what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of times there wouldn't be too fine a point put on it because the movie didn't exist yet, or the movie was being made, so they didn't really know what exactly the action was going to be beyond general terms.
And it seemed as though, particularly in New York, cover artists for pulps, magazines, posters, and paperbacks weren't as appreciated at the time by art critics. Why was that?
Well, I mean, there's always kind of been a little bit of a predisposition against commercial art because, and I wish I could say some of my best friends are art critics, but from the critic's point of view, they're looking at something and they're saying, well, somebody told this artist what to do. There was an assignment, and so they're not really, painting from the heart. Up until even the early 80s, the word, almost any time you heard the word illustrator, it was preceded by the word mirror. Oh, Norman Rockwell, he's a mirror illustrator, which meant that basically it wasn't wholly his conception to paint a particular picture. He received an assignment and he did it. So kind of the difference is that illustrators are forced to work on deadline, for one thing, and they are conveying someone else's ideas, but it allows them to pay their bills too. There's no, you don't hear about starving illustrators in the way that you would hear about starving artists, living in a cold water flat in Paris somewhere.
Art in general still remains very subjective and open to interpretation for a lot of people, visually and psychologically. How it connects to a person, again, is a very individualized thing. And we just talked about how illustrators at the time, who in certain ways sold themselves out. I mean, they were taking on projects that were handed down to them by bosses or whomever else, weren't as appreciated as those who express themselves individually like fine artists. Now, 60 to 70 years later, it seems like from a collectability standpoint, though, even though they weren't appreciated by art critics as much at the time, artists like you mentioned Norman Rockwell, there's Norm Sanders, and Charles Adams and Reynold Brown, they've become more popular, and you look at stuff that goes to auction, it's kind of come full circle in a sense. They seem to have become every bit, if not more popular than fine artists. Why do you think people from a collectability standpoint have gravitated towards these artists? Is there something they all have in common?
Well, I think I'd say that they do all have something in common, and that thing is really an idealized vision that they have of what the world looks like. Okay, so you mentioned Charles Adams. Well, the Charles Adams collector out there is not the same guy or woman who buys Norman Saunders or Norman Rockwell or Gil Elfgren. So a lot of it has to do also with kind of a nostalgia for this idealized vision of how the world looked at a certain point. If you're looking at even the pinup artists like Elfgren, Gil Elfgren, people of a certain age are nostalgic for that look, that kind of glamorous celebration of the female form. And so they can connect to that as something that they look at and say, isn't that great? And this goes way beyond pinups. If you look at car advertising, you say, wow, look at that car. Isn't that great? And that's a very different kind of response than people would have to quote-unquote fine artists like, I don't know, name a couple people, Jasper Johns or Robert Motherwell or Franz Klein or any of these people who you have to kind of make your own interpretation of a more abstract depiction.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. So we mentioned Reynold Brown, who is my favorite poster artist of all time. I know a lot of other collectors and people's as well. The Reynold Brown family selected you as the broker for all the original art pieces they still have in their possession. And I remember reading that his, Reynold Brown's wife, was of Swiss-Mexican descent. Are they now the trustees for his artwork?
Well, the kids are, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Brown's widow passed away, when was that? A year and a half ago, I think. My apologies if it was two and a half to all the Brown kids, but it was fairly recently that she passed.
Mm-hmm.
And so the kids are, the kids are kids. They tend to be older than I am. They're in charge.
Mm-hmm. So I did do some research on Reynold Brown before I had you on, and I noticed that one of the things that I found out about Brown was how determined and how hardworking he was, even from an early age. He dropped out of art school after his dad died of cancer in his early 20s, and saw that he began to draw comics for Hal Forrest. We had a couple of weeks ago noted poster historian and Hollywood art director Mike Kaplan on the show, and we talked about renowned painter Al Hirschfeld, who also got started drawing comics and cartoons for the New York Times. Is that how it worked back then? I mean, did most artists cut their teeth drawing comics in newspapers or in books before they could work independently and work on more significant projects? Was that kind of a training ground for them?
Kind of in broad strokes, yes. There are, though, a lot of different paths to success. And the kind of, starting out in the comic world and branching out and getting a big break or two is one of them. Another person who did that is a very well-known illustrator named Austin Briggs, who did all sorts of stuff. But he began as drawing comics and, became an illustrator beyond the comic stuff because that's kind of where the money was. And he had a drive and a desire to succeed that got him to the renown that he eventually enjoyed. And kind of another path, I said there were several paths, but another path that was popular certainly was starting out working in an art studio, whether that meant washing someone else's brushes or running errands, going out for coffee and donuts and stuff. There was really kind of a studio apprentice system in place that allowed a lot of illustrators to get their start. They couldn't just enter the field, fully formed, if you want to think of it that way. They couldn't just go out and say, well, I've done these illustrations for a book. Would you like to publish this book? It rarely works out.
I noticed that for poster artists, as well as some other commercial artists, that they didn't sign their work. And I noticed, too, that a lot of the international poster artists were often kind of given that fine art, imagination, more liberty to create and draw the posters and artwork as they saw fit, and they even signed their works. I did notice, though, that on some of the original art for paperback, Bantam paperbacks, that the artwork was signed, albeit not like in the image area that would be used for publication. Was that pretty common back in the day?
I'd say that was pretty common, yeah. And they're like a lot of the things we're talking about, there are kind of two ways to look at this. From one point of view, artists who were aspiring to be something wanted to make sure that their name appeared somewhere on the artwork, even if it wasn't going to appear on the cover of the book, because it's a small world and people would become aware of who painted what, and they'd want other art directors, say, to have an inkling of their abilities, their talents. And some of the publishers, in that kind of same regard, some of the publishers tried to keep especially talented artists to themselves, and so they wouldn't let them sign it, so that they could continue to do covers for, say, Bantam Books or Dell Books or whoever, in that it would be kind of this secret of who painted this. So you see that going on at the same time. And there are, of course, other aspects to the whole to sign or not to sign question.
Mm-hmm. So even now, when major artworks are commissioned, sometimes the artists go off photographs as opposed to completely going off their own imaginations. Was that pretty common for the 1950s? I mean, I remember seeing a film with Kirk Douglas on Van Gogh, and I've obviously read about Van Gogh and how other artists worked outdoors. Was it common, though, for commercial artists to draw based off, like, photographs and stills they'd been given?
Well, I think much more so in the movie market than anything else, because if you're doing a movie in which, Rock Hudson is the star, or Ava Gardner or somebody, your depiction on the poster, you as a movie poster artist, your depiction on the poster damn well better look like Rock Hudson. There better be no question of who this is. And so, in that way, working from photographs is the best thing to do. You want to make sure that everybody can instantly recognize Rock Hudson is Rock Hudson, because he's the draw, certainly. And if you look at even Reynold Brown's, he did a movie poster for a movie which I've never seen, and I'm kind of proud to say I've never seen it. Taza, son of Cochise, in which cast Rock Hudson as an Indian. And if you look at the poster, and the family still has that piece of art, if you look at the poster, you say, hey, it's Rock Hudson. You don't say, oh, it's another Indian picture. So I think that, kind of get back to what the question was, you see most people, at least in the movie poster section, working from stills and photographs. Mm-hmm. Going all the way back to as early as films go. Films in the 1910s, their advertising featured Fatty Arbuckle or whoever, and you knew instantly it was him. You had to.
But some of the popular science covers that Reynold Brown did, too, were absolutely amazing. People think of Reynold Brown, they think of poster art, but he did a lot of magazines, and he did some book covers as well. And I'm thinking of those popular science covers he did where, you had a car that was driving off the top of a skyscraper, or there were skeletons in a newly advertised car advertising new seat belts the reader must have for safety. Did Brown retain ownership rights to the covers for magazines like Popular Science or Outdoor Life? Or are they now in the archives of, say, like Tribune Media, who acquired Popular Science in the 50s and 60s? How did that work?
Well, that's a really good question. There are a couple things to keep in mind, as general observations. One of them is that an illustrator's lot in life is to provide something for their client, in this case, say Popular Science, that will sell the magazine. Okay? So once the illustrator has created that piece of art and turned it in, its viability for future use is something that's really in question. You can't run off to another magazine and sell the same image for a cover to them. So once the artist has been paid and the art's turned in, sounds cynical, but its life is done. It's filled its purpose, and so from the point of view of a lot of publishers and a lot of artists, that was the end of the road. And that's why so much illustration art at that time and beyond, up through the 80s, so much of it was just, routinely destroyed because it didn't serve a purpose after a certain point. Now, there are other parts to that before you get a lot of calls, from people saying, oh, Fred's wrong again, are ancillary rights, and people have begun, starting in, say, probably the 70s, to resell images in other markets. So if something was a paperback cover here, it could be used as a movie poster in, Argentina or whatever. And so artists became much more aware of that as a possibility and kind of strove to have a more consistent stream of income by doing things like selling second rights. So at that point, and it's hard to say exactly when that happened, but at that point, kind of the viability of keeping art changed. So I don't really know the specifics of the contract with, say, Popular Science, but chances are that the vast majority of that art does not exist.
Mm-hmm. So we've been talking about Reynold Brown, and he moved earlier on in his career from New York back to Hollywood. And after working at a local college, where in fact two of his students were Bob Peak, who did the original artwork for Apocalypse Now and Superman, amongst a host of many others, and Drew Struzan, who did most of the Star Wars posters, and Indiana Jones. He also did Back to the Future. He was introduced at this art college to Misha Callis, who at the time was the art director for Universal Studios in Hollywood, and father of Albert Callis, who became the head art director at AIP and illustrator for very famous movie posters such as Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Amazing Colossal Man, and Invasion of the Saucer Man. He was also the original founder of the International House of Pancakes restaurants. He was the first one, Albert Callis, who gave Brown his first poster assignment, correct?
I think that's correct.
Because I think the big project that he worked on, Reynold Brown, his first project, was The World in His Arms with Gregory Peck, right? That was one of the major ones.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you look at the artwork for that, you can see how much effort he put into it. So he was looking to make a big splash early on like that. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So how did that work? I mean, when an artist drew movie posters, did he come up with some preliminary drafts like we talked about in pencil, and then begin work on the actual poster? I mean, were there any contracts? The artist, was he an employee of Universal, AIP, or Paramount, or did they work like they do today, contract W-9 on project to project?
I think that at that point he probably would have been, as you say, W-9, what they call work for hire. In other words, he'd get an assignment, he'd be kind of chosen by the people making the decisions at the studio that he was the guy for that poster.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd say, okay, give us sketches and we'll go from there. So there was never, again, this is a broad observation, not necessarily specifically to Brown, although I think it probably holds true to Brown too. There was never any guarantee that he would get the next assignment. In other words, if they're doing Away All Ships this week and some creature movie next week, there would be no guarantee that he would be the one to do that. So he wouldn't be treated as an employee. It would always be kind of work for hire.
Now, would he be competing with other artists in terms of would he submit, kind of like an actor or actress goes and tries out for a part in a film, but would he be submitting a preliminary draft with other artists, or how would that work?
Well, that could certainly happen that way. I think that more often than not, the studios would look at someone's workload saying, oh, geez, he's already working on 3 projects for us. Who else do we have who can do this? And they would make a decision based on that rather than quite so competitive a format as you described there. Although that did change. You mentioned Bob Peak before, and he's kind of a major player in looking at how that all changed. But that's another story. So I think that I think that it was mostly the studio saying, Brown's our guy for this, or, whoever. I'm just using Brown as an example.
Now, a lot of people look at Brown and they see a movie poster and they think that he did the entire poster, but then you look at the original art and there were people that he worked with on a poster. We had mentioned Creature from the Black Lagoon or Time Machine, who were actually in charge of creating the lettering and text on the posters, right? So the art would, once he finished the art, it would be passed around to different departments, right? Like a car on an assembly line.
Very much so. But a lot of times the, say the lettering, a lot of times that would be done on, say, Mylar as an overlay to the artwork. It wouldn't necessarily always be right on the surface of the art. Although, certainly there are examples where it was.
Mm-hmm.
But, if you think about it, somebody who is able to express themselves in the way that Brown was able to express himself, you wouldn't necessarily look at his artwork and say, wow, I bet that guy was just a great letterer too. It's a different mindset. It's a different part of the process. And people who are good letterers can churn that stuff out. Well, could churn that stuff out, basically with computers, all that's out the window, but could turn out hand lettering just so much faster and so much more consistently than a guy like Reynold Brown, I think.
And were there any guarantees after they had done? Because I know there were some projects Brown worked on where he actually drew the poster, or he drew a poster design for the film, and it was actually never used. Were they paid the same either way?
Again, as a general rule, no, they wouldn't have been. A lot of publishers, and I'm pretty sure this spills over into movie studios too. A lot of publishers would have what's called a kill fee. In other words, if you painted a picture to completion that they said, oh, we want to have you paint this picture, and then they don't publish it, there would be what's known as a kill fee. So the artist is paid for their effort, but not at the same rate as if it was. So, for example, back when they painted covers for news magazines like Time or Newsweek or whatever, a weekly magazine didn't leave much time for an artist to do something. So they would work ahead with the news magazine trying to anticipate who's going to be in the news in 2 weeks. Well, then some big thing happens in the world, and all of a sudden you need somebody else on the cover, someone who there's no art for. So the first piece of art would receive a kill fee. The artist would, for doing that.
Yeah, there were also, let me ask you this, there were also some incredible panels he did for magazines such as Boy's Life and Argosy in the 40s. I mean, these were really sensational black and white, noir-esque drawings Brown did. I always wondered what happened, and you probably wouldn't see this in the art, but when they're using like gouache or another type of medium to draw on that's irreversible with ink, what would happen if they made a mistake?
Well, there are a bunch of ways, and it depends on the medium, of course. In something like gouache, which is basically watercolor with more color in it than traditional watercolor, so more pigment, more, body to it. They, painted someone's head and they got it wrong, according to the art director. Oh no, that guy's not supposed to be Native American, he's supposed to be Chinese. So something like that, a good artist would go back and correct it. They'd be able to change it enough so that it would hold up under reproduction. Whether that meant painting over the whole face and redoing it, or scratching out the old face and redoing it, or just changing a few little features, not the face as a whole. All of these things happened, and it does depend a lot on the medium. Just as an aside here, I got a pen and ink in a couple days ago that is by this guy Orson Lowell, who was a magazine illustrator for Life magazine, and this particular piece is from, I think it's 1913. Anyway, he has this room full of people, all of whom were drawn in pen and ink, and you can see that at some point he didn't like two of the heads. So he cut out pieces of paper to fit over the old drawing and drew new heads on them. And it's really cool to look at something 100 years old, 100 plus years old, and see the process. And it makes you wonder, gee, well, this looks good to me, but I wonder what the old head looked like. I wonder what's underneath that patch. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's cool. It's one of the things I run across that I think is really cool, and that probably qualifies me as a nerd.
No, it's definitely cool. And there were also we mentioned no digital equipment back in the days, no scanners. So some of these posters that Brown drew were gigantic, 81 by 81 inch 6 sheets or 24 sheets. How did they go from the original drawings to blowing them up into these large posters? What was the process for that?
They would have a photograph of the original art, okay, and they would be able to blow that up a certain percentage or certain number of times up, if you want to think of it that way. But where you run into problems is where it's a huge thing. Say even a 3 sheet, that becomes very expensive to print on a piece of paper that size for a variety of reasons. So they would print it in 3 separate sheets. So that kind of helped hold the detail in that you're printing it in 3 parts, so you don't have to be quite as tight on the focus as if it were 3 times larger. And it allowed you to print things very big. So what they would do, my understanding is, they would photograph it in a way that they could divide the composition into kind of a grid pattern. Okay, and if it's whatever number of sheets it is, they would divide it into that many sections so that they'd print each of them separately. And then it became, almost an art form to match them up right when you're standing there 100 feet above Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles to line them up so it looks good.
And we mentioned earlier, too, about how some of the artists, particularly Reynold Brown, they did artwork that they either had to redo or it never found its way on the posters. And one of them I was thinking about while we were talking was The Incredible Shrinking Man. That movie wasn't shot in 3D, but Brown drew the poster art of the cat and in 3D. It actually looks amazing in 3D, but they made him redo the image because of the way the film was shot. It wasn't shot in 3 dimensions. What happened to the original works that didn't get published, such as in this case?
Well, I think that it's hard for me to speak to that one specifically as far as what happened to that piece of art. I suspect that it's going to depend at what point that decision was made, at what point the change was made. Had Brown already turned in the first version, and then they changed their mind about how it was going to be shot, or was he just in the working stages of it? If he was in the working stages of it, he probably would have just pitched it in the garbage. Mm-hmm. Even Reynold Brown, who was actually better about, seems to me, better about keeping stuff and getting stuff back from the studios and everything than most.
Mm-hmm. I think I did remember him either finding out that these were being flipped by the studios or there was real value in these. Like I said, they were just throwing them out, and so at some point in his career he decided he was just going to start keeping them, as many as he possibly could.
Yeah, and of course, it didn't hurt to be, Reynold Brown in that situation because, he was a big deal. At his big deal now, he was a big deal then, so he could, he was in a position where he could say, well, I want this back. Once it's been shot for reproduction as a magazine ad or as a poster or lobby card or billboard or whatever it was, he was in a position where he could say, you know what, when you're done with that, you're going to give it back to me. Mm-hmm. And they would, because they wanted to, they were friendly and wanted to keep a good relationship with him and everything. So, yeah, it was a situation where the artwork itself, once the publicity had been done, it didn't really mean much to the studios. Studios didn't think in terms of, well, you know what, sometime, maybe in 60 years or so, we're going to make a museum and we're going to have all this stuff in. That just wasn't, it wasn't on their brains at all, doing that kind of thing, this kind of archiving of the history of, say, a studio or advertiser, publisher, anybody.
It seems crazy that they wouldn't know the value of this stuff, and they wouldn't know that this was something you wanted to save and preserve for future generations to appreciate and enjoy, but they just didn't. This stuff was typically trashed and thrown out.
Yeah, it wasn't on the radar for them. Mm-hmm. They were busy making films, and even the art department at these places, even Disney, who was maybe more cognizant or sympathetic or sensitive to, well, geez, what will people think in 100 years? Mm-hmm. They weren't keeping everything that was done. No way. That didn't come in until quite a bit later in the case of Disney.
So I figured you would be the person to talk to about the whereabouts of some of the original Reynold Brown posters. I wanted to ask you first about the I Was a Teenage Werewolf poster, because this was an interesting one. It was an early collaboration between Brown and Albert Callis, who we talked about earlier. And I read where part of the terms for Callis coming over to AIP and working with Roger Corman was that he would have full control over the picture's publicity and marketing. Have you ever seen the original poster for, because I know it was drawn by Callis and Reynold Brown. They both did the artwork for that one. It wasn't all Brown. Have you ever seen the artwork for I Was a Teenage Werewolf publicly offered for sale, or does Albert Callis still own the original?
I don't know. I mean, I know I haven't seen it out there for sale. Okay. Whether he owns it or what, I can't even really venture a guess. Mm-hmm. But I will say that if you look at the Reynold Brown book, the poster as it's reproduced in there, which is pretty clearly from the poster, not from the art, it really represents a departure for Brown. It's much more designed than, say, something like A Revenge of the Creature, which is all about the narrative. Teenage Werewolf is very graphic in its approach, and that's something that I think, however you want to think of it, Callis brought to the table with that.
Now, you mentioned Revenge of the Creature, which is the first of the two sequels, but the original Creature from the Black Lagoon from 1954, that poster, which there's obviously several different versions made for several different styles of movie posters. Do you know the whereabouts of the original art for this piece? I remember reading that Reynold Brown's son, Franz, said that his father never got the artwork back from Universal for the original Creature from the Black Lagoon. Have you ever seen the original artwork for this movie?
I have not, and you know what? I'm sure that Franz is 100% right on that.
Okay. So I guess Universal, in a sense, they have their own archives where a lot of the originals still are, right? The ones that were done for some of the bigger features, I mean, they have a vault where these are all at too, right?
Well, one hopes so, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know, but I would hope they do.
Yeah. And then we talked about Revenge of the Creature as well too, which is beautiful artwork as well, the first of the two sequels. And I know that Reynold Brown a lot of times used his family members to model either as actors or actresses for his poster art. And I know that one of his daughters was used as Lori Nelson in the pose where the Gillman's carrying the woman. And there's this beautiful full-page spread of Revenge of the Creature in his book. I feel it's some of his best artwork. What's the story on the whereabouts of the original artwork for Revenge of the Creature?
Well, getting back to what we said at the beginning, being that I was at Illustration House for a good long time, we sold that. Illustration House sold that probably in 95 and 96 or so. And so I don't really recall offhand who bought it, but it did exist at that point and went to a collector at that point. And I haven't seen it on the market since, so I'm assuming that it's still there.
Okay, and I guess that was after Reynold Brown had passed away that a lot of this artwork started, making its way to market.
Yeah.
So one of the probably one of my favorites that he did was The Time Machine, which was based on H.G. Wells' short novel and directed by George Powell, who we'll talk about here in a bit. This film obviously has a big history of how long it took to get financed. I noticed that in the Reynold Brown book, there were two original artworks that he did for The Time Machine, one horizontal and the other vertical. The purples are amazing, and they're unbelievably detailed. The artwork is. I always thought the posters for the films were kind of lackluster, though, because they took this magnificent image that Reynold Brown did, and they put this khaki white border on it, which I didn't particularly ever care for. But what's the story on the whereabouts of the original artwork for The Time Machine? Have you ever seen it?
I'm trying to think. I don't think I've seen it reproduced in the book, but I don't think I've ever seen that in person.
Okay.
And kind of to me, that probably means that a member of the family has it.
Okay.
Because they had, obviously for the book, they found the artwork to shoot for the book. And they don't say, they don't as a rule say this in the book anyway, but they don't say, photograph courtesy of, whoever. So I think that probably a family member owns it, but I couldn't say that for sure. I don't, despite the fact that I represent the family in selling stuff, I don't know everything they have. You've got to remember too, as part of it, that Brown had 8 kids, and they're pretty far flung around the country, and I only know a couple of them. So it could very well be that one of the other siblings has it.
Now on to This Island Earth, which is one of the more memorable Universal B science fiction films from the 50s. What about the original art for this one? You see it in the book. Have you actually seen this one, the original artwork for This Island Earth?
Well, I have seen the artwork for, I want to say it was the insert poster side. For those who might not know, the taller vertical one. That was sold by Illustration House.
Wow.
At auction in 1994. So 3 years after Brown died. And in 94, which, that's a while ago now, brought 20,000.
Only 20,000, but today it very well could go for 10 times that amount. What do you think?
Yeah, if it were to come up now at auction, I always get into trouble when I speculate about that. But I would say certainly quite a bit more than 20,000.
Yeah.
I really, because at auction, you never know what's going to happen. This is part of what makes auctions interesting. I'd be flabbergasted if it didn't go for 80 or 90 at least.
Yeah.
But the world's changed. The world's changed a lot in 24 years, and kind of the high end stuff, the best examples of people's art that collectors want.
Well, one of the things I did want to ask you about is probably, along with The Creature from the Black Lagoon, his most famous poster of them all, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. And Obviously, a lot of listeners probably have seen this poster if they've seen even Pulp Fiction with Quentin Tarantino in the drive-in bar with Uma Thurman and John Travolta. They're sitting in this bar called Jackrabbit Slim's, and there's even a reproduction Attack of the 50-Foot Woman movie poster in there. Before I asked you about the whereabouts of the original art for this poster, we mentioned The Time Machine and that it was directed by George Pal. But I also read that there was a huge house fire at George Pal's home that destroyed a lot of the original artwork that he owned. And I don't know how that relationship was with Brown and Pal, and if he agreed to give him some paintings or whatever. But can you tell us about the original artwork for Attack of the 50-Foot Woman?
Sure. I can tell you that the best information that I have is that it no longer exists, that it was burned up in a fire, and I'm assuming it was the Pal fire. But
the Time Machine that we talked about, that wasn't in. You don't think that was? Was the before the first publishing of Reynold Brown's book? I think still came after George Pal's house fire, which would make sense that the Time Machine original art still exists. But you don't think that the Time Machine art was destroyed as well, do you?
No, I really don't, because my impression was that the house fire was quite a while before, and so I think that the Time Machine must have stayed much closer to home for the publishers to have a chance to photograph it. I don't think it was in Pal's collection, but I mean, I don't know that. I'm conjecturing here.
But the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman original art, you think was?
I suspect so. Yeah.
And
that's the story that I heard.
In terms of an estimate for that one, are we talking an easy six figures, if not more, for that piece? Easily.
Let me share a quick anecdote with you. I did a show in San Francisco called WonderCon, which has now moved to Anaheim, since. But I did this show in 2011, and a guy came into the booth, and he said, "Oh, I see you have some Reynold Brown artwork. I love Reynold Brown." And so we start chatting about it. And he said, what about Attack of the 50-Foot Woman? Does the family have it? Can you look into this? What's the story with it? And I said, so far as anybody knows, it was destroyed. It doesn't exist. So, kind of cool your jets. And he said, well, let me ask you, Fred, what do you think that would sell for if you could find it? And I said, well, it's kind of a little bit of an exercise because I don't think it exists, but if I ever found it, and I'm trying to, concoct a number in my head, I said, have to be 150,000. It would just have to be. It's a very famous, very desirable image. And he kind of pauses and, rubs his face, and he says, if you can find it, I'll give you 3 times that. And,
wow.
Of course, it's very easy to say that when the thing probably doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
But he seemed like he was sincere in saying that. If you can find it, I'll pay you, whatever that is, $450,000.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's very easy to say, well, if Sophia Loren rings my doorbell, I'll take her out to lunch.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm. And that's that for a poster, for original art for a poster like that. I mean, it's just such an iconic image. I can't imagine it for selling any less than that either.
But I'm sorry to say, we'll probably never know because it's not going to show up. I don't think.
So Brown got tired of drawing posters. I read where they were becoming more and more explicit. There were bikinis, parties on the beach, people smoking, stuff we would just consider the norm kind of for the 21st century we're living in now. But he got tired of the demands of drawing movie posters, so he started moving on to landscapes and westerns and outdoors. And I read where there was a point, I think it was actually in his 50s, where he tragically suffered a stroke and heart attack that left him paralyzed on the right side of his body. And a lot of people don't know this, but I read too where Reynold Brown was ambidextrous. But in a way, if you look at the later art he did in his late 50s after the accident, in this, even though it's not as detailed, it's still pretty spectacular. And I know he was able to retrain himself with his wife, Mary Louise, and I think she was a talented artist in her own right, correct?
Yeah, she was.
Mm-hmm. It's just it's pretty remarkable that you've got artists who have suffered these losses or had these disabilities. I mean, even think of musicians like Ray Charles and Stevie Wonder, who were able to produce this incredible body of work against all odds and circumstances, even later on in his career.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with everything you said. It's interesting because in the case of a visual artist like Reynold Brown, so little of it is actually the hand. Okay, you hear about in the artist's hand. Well, it's the artist's brain that is really doing the heavy lifting. And so if the brain can speak equally effectively to the left hand as to the right hand, then you can still produce good art. So it's mostly how the brain talks to what the eye sees and what it tells the brain, and then what the brain tells the other parts of the body to do.
Yeah.
It is amazing, and I did see a story, and you've probably seen it too, and I think it kind of had to be in the Reynold Brown book, about how in the early days, before he was doing movie posters, in the early days when he was doing the aviation work, I mean, these guys would work long hours, and fatigue was always a problem. And, I can't remember who it was who was telling the story now, but one of his kind of studio mates was saying, I was always envious of Brown because when his hand would cramp up or get tired, he'd just, shift to the other hand and do it.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else had to, take a break or shake their hand or whatever, and Brown would just switch. And that's an
amazing talent.
It's amazing talent, and one of the things that really set Brown apart from, his contemporaries.
Yeah. So commercial art slowed down in the 1950s, if I recall, and it seems like more magazines that Reynold Brown had drawn the cover art for or done centerfolds or just artwork inside kind of started moving more and more towards actual photographs as opposed to illustrations. Did instant and personal cameras becoming widely available have an impact on illustrators in the 50s?
Yeah, they did. That's kind of the short answer. But prior to the 50s, if you were working from photographs at all, if you weren't just painting live from the model, you had to hire the models, set up the photographs, shoot the photographs, get the film developed, and get it back. Unless a lot of illustrators were set up to do all this in their own homes. They'd have their own dark room and everything. But still, there was a longer, I don't know if lag time is the right word, but a longer period between exposing the photograph and having something to work from than when Polaroid and Instamatic cameras came along. They could say, okay, sit over there and look scared. Press a button, 60 seconds later, you have something you can work from. rather. And so that kind of changed how a lot of illustrators worked. It sped up the process in a certain way, which was great for them, but it also meant that other people could do the same thing, that there was more competition in terms of getting it right, so having the right thing to work from to create the image.
Such fascinating stories about artists, and again, my favorite poster artist of all time, Reynold Brown, who was, as humble as they come. Thanks for sharing that. Well,
Sure.
That's gonna wrap it up for today's show here on News and Movies Radio. You can check out all of our latest interviews and movie reviews by subscribing through email at newsandmoviesradio.com or by clicking the subscribe button on our News and Movies Radio Podomatic, YouTube, or Apple iTunes store pages. We're 100% listener-funded radio. If you enjoyed today's show, please consider making a donation to the show through our Patreon page at patreon.com/News and Movies Radio. We'll be back in the coming weeks with more interviews and stories from pop culture collectors, dealers, and enthusiasts alike. Thanks so much again, Fred, for your time and being on the show today.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.